The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Riverside Estates, a peaceful suburban neighborhood tucked away from the chaos of the city. The kind of place where neighbors waved hello, where children played safely on tree-lined streets, and where families came to build their perfect American dreams. Corinne Mitchell had always felt that Riverside Estates was exactly where she and her family belonged. The tree-lined avenue was quiet, the homes were charming with well-maintained gardens, and the sense of community was strong. It was the sort of neighborhood where you could leave your front door unlocked without worry, where the most exciting thing that happened was usually the annual 4th of July block party. Corinne had woken up at 7 that morning, as she did every weekday. Her husband Michael was already in the shower, preparing for another day at his corporate finance job downtown. He had recently been promoted to senior analyst, a position that came with longer hours and increasing stress. Corinne had noticed his mood shifting lately. He seemed more irritable, quicker to anger over small things, but she attributed it to work pressure. That's what he always said anyway. It's just work stress, honey, nothing to worry about. Their daughter Sarah was still sleeping peacefully in her small bedroom down the hall, her favorite stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. Sarah Mitchell had just turned 3 years old 2 months ago. She was a beautiful child with golden ringlets that seemed to catch the sunlight, bright blue eyes that sparkled with curiosity, and a laugh that could light up an entire room. Corinne loved her daughter fiercely, the way all mothers do. Sarah had been a planned pregnancy, a child born into what everyone believed would be a happy, stable family. By mid-morning, after Michael had left for work and Sarah had eaten her breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, Corinne decided it was the perfect time for some outdoor work. The September weather in the Midwest was absolutely spectacular, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of late summer flowers. Corinne had always been passionate about gardening. Her backyard was her sanctuary, a place where she could think, create beauty and find peace. The flower beds were bursting with late-blooming zinnias, marigolds, and dahlias. She had also planted several ornamental grasses that swayed beautifully in the breeze. "Come on, sweetheart," Corinne called to Sarah, who was playing with her toy kitchen on the back patio. "Mommy's going to work in the garden. You can play right here where Mommy can see you." Sarah, wearing pink overalls and her favorite sparkly sneakers, nodded enthusiastically. She was at that wonderful age where she was content to entertain herself for periods of time. Corinne set up a small play area near the patio with Sarah's coloring books, crayons, and a few of her stuffed animals. Sarah immediately became absorbed in her coloring, her small tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she worked a purple crayon across the page. Corinne had moved to the front of the property, where the flower beds needed serious attention. She had been meaning to deadhead the roses and tulips for weeks, and today seemed like the perfect opportunity. She wore her favorite gardening hat, a floppy straw hat that protected her fair skin from the sun, and a pair of well-worn gardening gloves that had seen better days. The work was meditative and satisfying. Each dead flower she removed represented renewal, the space for new growth. Time seemed to slip away as Corinne lost herself in her work. The neighborhood was quiet, almost somnolent. It was that peaceful midday hour when most people were either at work or inside their homes. The only sounds were the gentle snip-snap of her pruning shears, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the distant hum of someone's several blocks away. Corinne's mind wandered as she worked. She thought about what to make for dinner, whether she needed to call the pediatrician about Sarah's upcoming checkup, and the conversation she needed to have with Michael about his increasing moodiness. She didn't notice exactly when Sarah had finished her coloring. She didn't see her daughter pack away her crayons and abandon her spot on the patio. Corinne was so focused on the fragile stems of her prize roses, so absorbed in the therapeutic rhythm of her work, that she was completely unaware that her 3-year-old daughter had wandered away from the designated play area. Sarah, curious as all 3-year-olds are, had toddled over to the gate that separated the backyard from the front of the house. The gate had been left slightly ajar, no more than a few inches, but to a small child, it was an open invitation to adventure. Sarah had recently become fascinated by exploring, by seeing what lay beyond her familiar surroundings. She pushed the gate gently, and it swung open wider. With the kind of deliberate determination that only a toddler possesses, Sarah stepped through the gate onto the front sidewalk. The neighborhood street was empty. No cars were visible in either direction. No other children were playing outside. It was as if the entire world had paused. Sarah, wearing her pink overalls and sparkly sneakers, stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking both directions. She could see down the street to where Maple Avenue intersected with their residential road. The sun was high and warm on her small face. Then, from somewhere in the distance, Sarah heard something that made her pause. The sound was growing louder, first a distant wail, then increasingly clear. Sirens. Lots of sirens. Sarah's head tilted upward, the way children do when they hear something unfamiliar and fascinating. The sound grew louder and closer. Police sirens had a distinctive quality to them, a pattern that was simultaneously alarming and mesmerizing to a child who had probably only heard them a handful of times in her young life. Sarah stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching as the source of the sound approached. She could see the flashing lights now, red and blue strobes painting the street in alternating colors. A police car appeared around the corner, moving quickly but not recklessly. Behind it came another vehicle, and then another. This was clearly something important, something that had captured the attention of law enforcement. Sarah didn't move. She simply stood there, transfixed by the spectacle of it all. In her young mind, she had no concept of danger or why police cars rushed through neighborhoods with their sirens blaring. She only knew that something exciting was happening, and she was witnessing it firsthand. What Sarah couldn't have known was that these sirens were responding to a call, a break-in reported at a residence 2 blocks away. What she couldn't have known was that her presence on the sidewalk, apparently alone, was about to change everything. And what no one could have predicted was that, within the next few minutes, her encounter with a police officer and a K-9 partner would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel the carefully constructed facade of her family life. The sirens grew louder as they approached. Sarah stood motionless, a tiny figure in pink waiting. Officer James had been with the Riverside Police Department for nearly 13 years. He was the kind of cop who still genuinely cared about his community, who knew most of the residents by name, and who believed that law enforcement was about more than just enforcing rules. It was about protecting people. At 42 years old, with streaks of starting to show at his temples, carried the weight of his experience with grace and wisdom. He had seen the worst that humanity had to offer, and it had shaped him into someone who trusted his instincts above almost everything else. Duke, his K-9 partner, was a magnificent German shepherd, 4 years old, extremely well-trained and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to sense when something wasn't right. The partnership between and Duke was more than professional. It was deeply personal. Often said that Duke understood human behavior better than most humans did. The dog had an uncanny ability to read situations, to sense fear and deception, and to know when he needed to be protective versus when he needed to be gentle. That Tuesday afternoon, and Duke had been patrolling the Riverside Estates neighborhood, responding to a report of a break-in at a residence on Drive. The call had come in around 2:15 in the afternoon. A neighbor had noticed someone acting suspiciously near the back of a house, someone who didn't match the description of the homeowners. By the time Duke arrived on the scene, the suspected burglar had already fled. And Duke had spent the better part of an hour searching the area, following scent trails that Duke picked up. It had been a fruitless search, but that was part of the job. You couldn't catch every criminal, but you kept trying. Was heading back toward his patrol car, Duke trotting obediently beside him on his leash, when he noticed something unusual. A small figure stood alone on the sidewalk about 50 yards ahead. It took a moment to process what he was seeing. A toddler. A tiny child, probably no more than 3 or 4 years old, standing completely alone on a residential street without any adult supervision. "What the?" muttered, immediately changing course and walking faster toward the child. His mind began running through possibilities. Where were the parents? Had this child wandered away? Was this a medical emergency situation? As approached, he got a better look at the child. It was a little girl with golden curls and bright blue eyes. She was wearing pink overalls and sparkly sneakers that caught the afternoon sunlight. She wasn't crying or appearing distressed, which was unusual. Most lost children would be upset, scared, calling for their parents. This child simply stood there, watching and Duke approach with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. Immediately switched into professional mode. He slowed his pace, not wanting to startle the child or make Duke seem threatening. He kept the dog several feet away, positioning himself between Duke and the girl in a non-threatening manner. "Hey there, sweetheart," called out in his gentlest voice, the one he reserved for situations exactly like this. "Are you okay? Where's your mommy?" The little girl didn't respond. She simply stared then at Duke. Her expression was difficult to read, not quite fear, not quite curiosity, something else entirely, something that in that moment couldn't quite identify. "It's okay," continued, kneeling down slowly to bring himself closer to the child's eye level. This was standard protocol: make yourself less threatening by reducing your height and appearing less dominant. "I'm Officer, this is Duke. We're here to help. Can you tell me your name?" The child's lips moved slightly, but no words came out. She continued staring, her blue eyes fixed on his face with an odd intensity. Kept his hand on Duke's leash, making sure the dog remained calm and at a distance. Duke, sensing that this was a vulnerable human who needed protection, naturally became more alert and gentle. "Do you live nearby?" Tried again, speaking slowly and clearly. "Can you point to your house?" The child remained silent, was beginning to wonder if she had a speech delay or if she was simply too frightened to speak. But there was something else, something in her demeanor that suggested this wasn't just about fear. It was as if she was evaluating him, measuring him, trying to determine if he was safe. Then, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, the child's mouth opened. Her small voice, barely above a whisper, spoke 2 words that would change everything. "Bad man." Officer felt something cold run down his spine. His hands instinctively stilled on Duke's leash. The words were so deliberate, so clear despite being spoken in barely more than a whisper. They weren't the confused murmurings of a frightened child. They were a statement, an accusation. "Bad man," repeated, his voice carefully neutral even as his mind began firing in multiple directions. "Honey, did a bad man hurt you?" The child's eyes remained fixed on his face, and for just a moment, barely perceptible, she nodded. It was a small movement, almost uncertain, but it was definitely a nod. Straining kicked into high gear. He remained calm on the outside, but internally, every alarm bell was ringing. In his 13 years on the force, he had learned to trust these moments. He had learned that children, especially very young children, rarely lied about abuse. When they disclosed because something inside them had reached a breaking point. The fact that this child had approached a police officer and a police dog, and had then volunteered information about a bad man, suggested that she had been seeking help. "Okay, sweetheart," said gently, speaking into his radio with his free hand. "This is Unit 12. I have a small child, approximately 3 years old, on the sidewalk at Maple and Riverside. No adult supervision. Child has made a disclosure. I need backup, and I'm going to need Child Protective Services contacted immediately. Medical evaluation needed." The radio crackled with acknowledgement from dispatch. Within seconds, other officers were being redirected to his location. "Can you tell me your name?" asked the child again, more urgently now but still keeping his voice gentle. "Sarah," the child whispered, her voice even smaller than before. Sarah, that's a beautiful name, said. Sarah, do you know your mommy's name? Karen, Sarah replied, the word barely audible. Okay, Sarah, Karen is your mommy. Can you show me where your house is? Sarah lifted one small arm and pointed toward a house about 30 yards away. It was a modest two-story home with a well-maintained garden. Nothing sinister about it on the surface, just another suburban home. Good girl, Sarah said, though his mind was already processing the implications. You did a very good job telling me about the bad man. You were very brave. Sarah's expression shifted slightly. A hint of something, relief, validation, appeared in her young eyes. It was as if she had been carrying a burden too heavy for her small frame, and for just a moment, sharing it had lightened the load. Before could ask anything else, Karen Mitchell came running around the corner of the house, her gardening gloves still on, her face a mask of panic and confusion. Sarah, oh my God, Sarah, she cried out, rushing toward her daughter. I'm so sorry, officer. She must have wandered away from the patio. I was just... Ma'am, I need you to step back for just a moment, said, his voice taking on a more official tone. We have some concerns about your daughter's welfare. I've called for backup and child protective services. They'll be here in a few minutes. Karen's face went pale. What are you talking about? What concerns? Officer's eyes remained fixed on Karen's face, studying her reaction carefully. In all his years, he had learned to read people, to sense when something didn't add up. And right now, something definitely didn't add up. Sarah, standing between the officer and her mother, began to tremble. Karen Mitchell's face went from pale to completely white in the span of seconds. Her gardening gloves fell from her hands and landed on the sidewalk like discarded evidence. She looked at Officer, then at her daughter, then back at the officer again, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to form coherent words. I don't understand, Karen finally managed to say, her voice shaking. What concerns? Sarah's fine, she's a healthy, happy child. There's nothing wrong with her. What are you talking about? Officer maintained his professional demeanor, though his mind was already cataloging details. He had learned long ago that innocent parents typically responded with confusion and cooperation, but guilty ones often became defensive or evasive. Karen's response seemed genuinely confused, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Sometimes abusers were skilled at compartmentalizing, at keeping the abuse hidden even from their partners. Ma'am, your daughter made a disclosure, explained carefully, choosing his words with precision. She indicated that there is a bad man who has hurt her. We need to take this very seriously. A bad man? Karen's eyes widened further. That doesn't make sense. Sarah spends most of her time with me or at. The only adult male in her life is. She stopped abruptly, realization dawning on her face. Michael, you think Michael hurt her? That's insane. Michael loves Sarah. He would never. Ma'am, I'm not making accusations, interrupted gently but firmly. I'm following protocol. Child Protective Services is on their way. They'll need to interview you and conduct a full evaluation of Sarah. That's the next step in situations like this. Within minutes, the quiet residential street had transformed into something resembling a crime scene, though not in the dramatic television sense. A second police car arrived, its lights flashing. Then a dark sedan pulled up, and a professional-looking woman in her mid-40s emerged. This was Maria, a CPS investigator with 15 years of experience. Her face was calm and neutral, but her eyes were sharp and analytical. Maria had been doing this work long enough to know that most child abuse cases were never straightforward. They existed in murky areas where families were torn apart by allegations, where sometimes the accusations were true and sometimes they were false, but where the children, always the children, ended up wounded regardless. Officer, Maria greeted him with a professional nod before turning her attention to Karen and Sarah. I'm Maria from Child Protective Services. I need to speak with all of you, but first, I need to get Sarah somewhere safe and comfortable. Mrs. Mitchell, Is there someone who can come and pick up your daughter? A family member, perhaps? Corinne nodded numbly. My sister, I can call my sister, but I don't understand what's happening. Sarah is fine, she's just a confused little girl who… Your daughter used very specific language, Maria interrupted, not unkindly. When a child that young makes a disclosure, we have to take it seriously. That's the law and that's child protection protocol. Corinne's sister arrived 20 minutes later, confused and alarmed by the cryptic phone call. She took Sarah, who clung to her mother briefly before being led away by her aunt. Sarah didn't cry or protest, which was itself significant. A normally healthy child separated from her mother would typically exhibit distress. Sarah's compliance and passivity suggested that separation from adults wasn't unfamiliar to her, that perhaps she had experienced worse. Officer watched Sarah leave, his sharp eyes noting every detail. The child hadn't made eye contact with her mother as she was led away. She hadn't said bye-bye, mommy, or reached out her arms in protest. Instead, she had simply accepted what was happening with the resigned acceptance of someone accustomed to being moved around, to having things done to her. Back at the Mitchell house, Maria conducted a preliminary. She photographed Sarah's bedroom, noting the condition of the mattress, the toys, the general state of the room. She observed kitchen cabinets, looking for evidence of proper nutrition and care. She noted that the house was clean, well-maintained, and showed no obvious signs of neglect in terms of material conditions. Sometimes abuse happens in the best-looking homes, Maria commented to Officer as they walked through the house. The abuse isn't always about neglect, it's about power and control. Corinne sat at the dining room table, still in shock. Officer sat across from her, his notebook open. He had conducted thousands of interviews, and he knew how to ask questions in a way that seemed conversational while actually building a narrative. Tell me about Michael, said gently. Tell me about your relationship, any changes recently. Corinne took a shaky breath. He's been stressed. Work is demanding, he travels sometimes, but he's not, he would never hurt Sarah. Michael is a good father. Has he ever lost his temper, pressed, ever been aggressive? Everyone loses their temper sometimes, Corinne said defensively. It doesn't mean anything. Has he ever been aggressive toward you? Corinne hesitated. No, not toward me, but sometimes he gets irritable, he yells. Last week he slammed a plate down on the counter because his dinner was cold. And sometimes when Sarah cries, he gets frustrated. He'll say things like shut up or he'll grab her arm not to hurt her just to get her attention. But that's normal parenting, isn't it? Everyone disciplines their children. Officer felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. What Corinne was describing weren't red flags, they were sirens. An escalating pattern of anger, loss of control, violent behavior toward objects, and physical contact with the child during moments of frustration. These were textbook warning signs. I need to ask you something very directly, said, his voice steady and non-judgmental. Has Michael ever been alone with Sarah for extended periods? Corinne nodded slowly. Of course, he's her father, they spend time together. And during those times, have you noticed any changes in Sarah's behavior? Any physical marks? Any behavioral regression? Corinne's eyes filled with tears. She's been different lately, more clingy. She has accidents sometimes, even though she was mostly potty trained. And she doesn't like it when Michael gives her a bath. She gets upset and wants me to do it, but I thought that was just a phase. Maria, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward. Those are significant behavioral changes, Mrs. Mitchell. In children who have experienced trauma, those kinds of reactions are very common. No, Corinne said, shaking her head violently. No, you're wrong. Michael wouldn't do this. You're all jumping to conclusions based on what a confused 3-year-old said. She could have meant anything. Maybe she meant her teacher or maybe she meant something completely innocent and you're all reading into it. And exchanged a look. They had both heard this before, the denial, the rationalization, the desperate hope that someone had made a terrible mistake. "Mrs. Mitchell," Maria said gently, "we're going to need to bring Sarah to the hospital for a medical evaluation. Dr. Hammond is one of the best pediatric trauma specialists in the state. She'll conduct a thorough physical examination and talk with Sarah. If there is any evidence of abuse, the doctor will document it. If there isn't, then we'll all have our answer." Over the next hour, Officer and Maria conducted a more detailed interview with Corinne. They asked about Michael's family history, his childhood, any previous incidents. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. Michael's own father had been abusive. Michael had experienced trauma as a child. According to Corinne, Michael had been seeing a therapist years ago but had stopped treatment. He had said he was fine and didn't need help anymore. As and left the Mitchell house, they both carried the weight of what they knew. Statistically, most child abuse was perpetrated by someone the child knew well, a family member, a trusted adult. The pieces were starting to fit together, and none of them looked good. That evening, Dr. Hammond would conduct her examination of Sarah. And what she would find would transform suspicion into evidence, would begin the long process of dismantling a family and seeking justice for a child who had finally, courageously, asked for help. Dr. Hammond had dedicated her entire career to understanding and documenting child trauma. At 53 years old, with silver-streaked hair always pulled back in a neat bun and kind but observant eyes, she carried the weight of thousands of cases within her. She was the director of the Pediatric Trauma and Abuse Assessment Center at Riverside Medical Hospital, a position that required not only exceptional medical knowledge, but also an almost supernatural ability to communicate with frightened, traumatized children. The examination room where Sarah would be evaluated was nothing like a typical doctor's office. It had been carefully designed to be non-threatening, with soft lighting, child-friendly decorations on the walls, and toys scattered around. There was a children's book corner, a small table with coloring supplies, and a comfortable chair where a caregiver or support person could sit. Everything about the room was designed to help children feel safe and secure during what could be one of the most vulnerable moments of their lives. When Sarah arrived at the hospital with her aunt, she was quiet and withdrawn. She clutched a small stuffed rabbit that had been provided by CPS, a comfort item that would remain with her throughout the process. Maria accompanied them, as did Officer, though he remained in an adjacent observation room. The presence of law enforcement, even in plain clothes and out of uniform, could sometimes make children anxious, so protocol dictated that he stay nearby but out of sight. Dr. Hammond approached Sarah slowly and carefully, sitting down on the floor to bring herself to the child's eye level. This was her standard approach, never towering over the child, always making herself smaller and less threatening. "Hi, Sarah," Dr. Hammond said softly, her voice warm and genuinely kind. "My name is Doctor. I'm a doctor, but I'm not the kind of doctor who gives shots. I'm a doctor who helps children feel better. Would it be okay if we spent some time together?" Sarah nodded slowly, her small fingers gripping the stuffed rabbit more tightly. Dr. Hammond had learned that the children who had experienced trauma often gave away crucial information through their body language before they ever spoke a word. Sarah's defensive posture, her reluctance to make eye contact, her hypervigilance, all of it told a story. "I'm going to ask you some questions and then I'm going to do a gentle check of your body," Dr. Hammond explained. "It won't hurt, I promise. And if anything makes you uncomfortable, you can tell me to stop and I will stop immediately. Okay?" Sarah nodded again. The initial interview took 45 minutes. Dr. Hammond used age-appropriate language and dolls to help Sarah communicate. She asked open-ended questions, allowing Sarah to guide the narrative rather than feeding her suggestions. This was crucial. CPS and law enforcement training emphasized that children must be allowed to disclose at their own pace, in their own words, without leading questions that could be challenged later. "Sarah," Dr. Hammond asked gently, "does anyone touch your body in ways that make you uncomfortable?" Sarah's response was not verbal. Instead, she reached for the anatomically correct doll that Dr. Hammond had placed in front of her. With surprising deliberation for a 3-year-old, Sarah pointed to the doll's genital area. "Can you tell me who touches you there?" Dr. Hammond asked, her voice remaining calm and non-judgmental, even as her internal alarm bells rang loudly. "Daddy," Sarah whispered, barely audible. Dr. Hammond's heart broke a little, as it did in almost every case. She had been doing this work for 27 years, and the pain never got easier. She continued with her questions, documenting everything meticulously. Sarah indicated that her father touched her in ways that hurt her, that he told her not to tell anyone, that sometimes he was angry and his touching was very rough. Using the dolls, Sarah demonstrated movements and positioning that were consistent with sexual abuse. The precision of her actions, far too specific and coordinated for a 3-year-old who hadn't been through this before, was heartbreaking evidence that this had happened repeatedly, not as a one-time incident but as an ongoing pattern. After approximately an hour of interview, Dr. Hammond moved into the physical examination portion. She had Sarah change into a small hospital gown. Sarah's aunt remained in the room, providing comfort and support. Dr. Hammond's hands were gentle but thorough as she examined the child's body. What she found made her breath catch. There were bruises on Sarah's inner thighs in various stages of healing, some fresh and dark purple, others fading to yellow and green, indicating they had been inflicted at different times. On Sarah's buttocks, there were small circular bruises consistent with fingertip marks where the child had been gripped forcefully. Most concerning was the internal trauma. Dr. Hammond noted signs of physical injury to Sarah's genital area consistent with sexual abuse. There were small tears, areas of inflammation, and other medical indicators that this child's body had been violated repeatedly. Dr. Hammond's documentation was clinical and precise, but every word felt like a hammer blow to the heart. She photographed everything with the child's hospital identification number visible in each image. She collected samples that might contain DNA evidence. She noted the dates, times, and specific findings for each injury. When the physical examination was complete, Sarah was cleaned up and given a fresh hospital gown. Dr. Hammond called in a forensic specialist who collected additional evidence, swabs from various areas of the child's body, examination of her fingernails, documentation of any fibers or biological material that might help identify the perpetrator. In the observation room, Officer watched the proceedings on a monitor. He had maintained his professional composure through thousands of cases, but watching this happen to a 3-year-old still made his jaw clench. Maria stood beside him, her expression equally grave. "It's confirmed," Maria said quietly. "This was systematic, repeated sexual abuse. The medical evidence combined with her disclosure is irrefutable." Nodded, his mind already moving forward to the next steps. "We need to bring him in for questioning. We need to secure his home as a crime scene, and we need to make sure Sarah is placed in protective custody immediately." After the examination was complete, Dr. Hammond met with Sarah's aunt, Maria, and Officer in a private consultation room. She had her medical findings arrayed in front of her, photographs, notes, the clinical evidence of a child's suffering. "The evidence is clear," Dr. Hammond said, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. "Sarah has experienced significant sexual and physical abuse. The injuries are consistent with her disclosure. The pattern of injuries, some fresh, some healing, indicates this has been happening over an extended period of time, likely several months or longer. The trauma to her genital area indicates repeated penetrative abuse." Sarah's aunt put her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God," she whispered, "that poor baby." "Sarah is showing classic signs of trauma," Dr. Hammond continued. "She's dissociative, which is a protective mechanism her mind has developed to cope with what's being done to her. She's hypervigilant, constantly assessing whether adults around her are a threat. She displays age-regressive behaviors and emotional shutdown. With proper trauma-informed care and therapy, many of these symptoms can improve, but she will need intensive psychological support. Officer leaned forward. Based on your findings, can you definitively state that this child has been sexually abused? Yes, Dr. Hammond said without hesitation. The physical evidence alone is conclusive. Combined with her disclosure and behavioral indicators, there is no doubt in my professional opinion that this child has been sexually abused by an adult, most likely a caregiver with regular access to her. The meeting concluded with clear directives. Sarah would be placed in protective custody in the care of her aunt, with CPS maintaining guardianship until the legal process was complete. Michael Mitchell would be taken into custody for questioning. The family home would be processed as a crime scene. Evidence would be collected, documented, and preserved for prosecution. As they left the hospital, Officer made the call that would set everything in motion. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need a warrant issued for the arrest of Michael James Mitchell on suspicion of child sexual abuse and endangerment. Subject is employed at financial downtown location. Let's bring him in. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, could not be stopped. Michael Mitchell was sitting at his desk on the 34th floor of the financial building when the knock came on his office door. It was 3:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. He had just finished a conference call with potential investors, feeling energized and confident about a major deal that was about to close. His life, in his mind, was perfect. His career was ascending. His marriage was stable enough. His daughter was healthy and developing normally. He had compartmentalized his behavior so effectively that, in his conscious mind, he had nearly convinced himself that what he was doing to Sarah was normal, acceptable, even harmless. The knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Michael called out, looking up from his computer screen. Two uniformed police officers entered his office, followed by a detective. The moment Michael saw them, he knew. Something in their expressions, the purposefulness of their movement, the way they closed the door behind them, all of it told him that his world was about to change irreversibly. "Michael James Mitchell?" the detective asked, pulling out a badge. "Yes," Michael's voice cracked slightly. "What is this about?" "I'm Detective Martinez. We have a warrant for your arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Michael heard the words being read, but they seemed to come from very far away, as if he was listening to them through water. His hands went cold. His vision seemed to tunnel. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not at work. Not in front of his colleagues. The officers cuffed him with professional efficiency. They escorted him out of his office, down the hallway, past the curious and shocked faces of his, into the elevator, and finally down to the lobby. News travels fast in office environments, and by the time Michael reached the parking garage where the police car awaited, his company's HR department was already receiving calls about the incident. Security footage would be reviewed. Gossip would spread like wildfire through the office. The arrest itself took less than 15 minutes to process, but the social and professional devastation it would cause would take far longer to fully unfold. By 5:30 p.m. that evening, the news was spreading through Riverside Estates with the velocity of a wildfire. A man had been arrested. A child had been hurt. The peaceful suburban neighborhood where everyone knew their neighbors and believed their children were safe was shaken to its core. At the grocery store, neighbors whispered in the checkout line. At the community pool, where Michael had been seen teaching Sarah to swim just weeks ago, parents pulled their children closer. On social media, the threads began, first cautious, then increasingly accusatory and speculative. Reporters arrived, setting up cameras on street corners, trying to get interviews with shocked residents. "He always seemed so normal," Mrs. from 2 doors down told a local news crew, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "He waved at us every morning when he got the newspaper. You never would have guessed. My kids played with his daughter, another neighbor, Tom Harrison, said, his voice trembling. Thank God nothing happened to our children. This is absolutely sickening. The Mitchell house became the center of attention. Police tape cordoned it off as a crime scene. Forensic teams entered with their cameras and evidence collection kits. They photographed Sarah's bedroom, documenting the condition of her small bed, the toys she played with, the stuffed animals that had witnessed her suffering. They collected bedding for DNA analysis. They photographed the bathroom, noting the location of various fixtures in relation to where abuse might have occurred. Inside the house, they found Michael's laptop. They found private photos and video footage that corroborated Sarah's disclosure. They found journal entries in which Michael had documented his actions with a disturbing level of clinical detail, as if he was recording observations about a science experiment rather than describing the systematic abuse of his own daughter. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, and absolutely damning. Meanwhile, at the police station, Michael sat in an interrogation room with Detective Martinez, an officer. He had immediately requested an attorney, which was his right. But before his lawyer arrived, he was given another opportunity to speak, and in a moment of either arrogance or desperate hope, he chose to talk. I didn't hurt her, Michael said, his voice steady but his hands shaking slightly. Sarah is confused. She doesn't understand what she's saying. Children that age get things mixed up all the time. They imagine things. They hear things from other children or adults and incorporate them into their own narratives. Your daughter has physical injuries, officer said calmly, sliding medical photographs across the table. These injuries are consistent with what she disclosed. These aren't imagination, Mr. Mitchell. These are facts. Michael's face went white as he saw the photographs. For just a moment, his carefully constructed defense crumbled. Then he regrouped, pushing the photographs away. I want my attorney, he said flatly. Within an hour, Vincent Carlisle arrived at the police station. Carlisle was a well-known defense attorney with a reputation for being aggressive, expensive, and effective. He was the kind of lawyer that wealthy people hired when they found themselves in serious legal trouble. He immediately advised Michael to say nothing further without him present, and informed the detectives that all future communications would go through his office. But the damage was already done. The evidence had been collected, documented, and secured. The arrest warrant had been issued. Michael was booked into the county jail pending bail hearing. The story had captured the attention of local media, and within 24 hours it had also caught the attention of national news outlets. The narrative was compelling. Upstanding corporate professional arrested for child abuse. It played into the cultural fascination with the darkness lurking beneath suburban respectability. News vans lined Maple Street. Reporters stood in front of the Mitchell house doing stand-ups for evening news broadcasts. Internet sleuths began investigating Michael's social media presence, his professional history, his family background. His LinkedIn profile was picked apart. His Facebook page, which had been relatively inactive, was scrutinized for hidden clues about his true nature. Colleagues from his office gave interviews saying they were shocked, that Michael had always seemed quiet but professional, that there had been no indication of anything unusual. His extended family issued statements of disbelief and support for Michael, claiming he was being falsely accused, that there must be some terrible mistake. But at Riverside Medical Hospital, Dr. Hammond reviewed the medical evidence one more time. The photographs were clear. The physical findings were unambiguous. The forensic evidence was definitive. At the police station, Detective Martinez reviewed Michael's laptop, his journal entries, the photographic and video evidence. There was no mistake. There would be no mystery about what had happened. The only question now was whether the justice system would deliver justice, whether a jury would believe the evidence, whether, in a system designed to protect the rights of the accused, a small child's suffering would be deemed sufficient proof of guilt. Corinne Mitchell sat in her sister's living room, unable to comprehend how her life had shattered so completely in the span of just 36 hours. Her husband was in jail. Her daughter was traumatized and in protective custody. Her marriage was over. Her reputation was destroyed. The neighbors she had coffee with, the friends she had made, were all looking at her differently now, with pity, with suspicion, with the unspoken question, how could you not have known? Michael Mitchell sat in a jail cell and planned his defense. His attorney, Vincent Carlisle, began building his strategy. The evidence was substantial, but Carlisle knew from experience that substantial evidence didn't always lead to conviction. Juries could be persuaded. Doubt could be created. The truth, sometimes, could be buried under enough clever argumentation and reasonable doubt. The case was about to become even more complicated. The Riverside County Courthouse was an imposing structure built in the 1970s, all concrete and heavy columns, the kind of building designed to convey gravitas and the weight of justice. On the morning of Monday, March 15th, exactly 1 month after Michael Mitchell's arrest, the courthouse was flooded with media, spectators, and legal professionals. The case of State v. Michael James Mitchell had captured the attention not just of the local community, but of legal experts across the country who saw in it a fascinating intersection of child protection law, evidence admissibility, and the challenging question of how to prosecute abuse when the primary witness was a traumatized 3-year-old. Judge was a 30-year veteran of the bench, a woman who had earned a reputation for being fair but firm, intelligent but not pretentious. She had presided over hundreds of cases, from minor traffic violations to serious felonies. She understood the gravity of what was before her court. A child's safety and future hung in the balance. A man's freedom and reputation hung in the balance. The integrity of the justice system itself hung in the balance. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Sarah, no relation to Officer James, though the coincidence of names had been noted by trial watchers. Sarah was 41 years old, with a fierce reputation for protecting children's rights. She had spent 15 years in the prosecutor's office specializing in child abuse cases, and she knew every nuance, every legal precedent, every trick that defense attorneys tried to use to discredit child victims. Vincent Carlisle, for the defense, was equally formidable. At 58 years old, with silver hair and a bearing that suggested he had stepped out of a legal drama, Carlisle had successfully defended 37 cases that had been brought against him, with an average acquittal rate that was significantly higher than the national average. He was expensive, he was good, and he was absolutely committed to ensuring that his client received what he argued was a vigorous defense against what he claimed were baseless accusations. The courtroom was packed. The media had been restricted to certain sections, but the tension in the room was palpable. Corinne Mitchell sat in the front row, carefully separated from her husband. She had written letters to the prosecutor's office indicating her support for prosecution, that she believed the evidence, and that she wanted Michael held accountable for what he had done to their daughter. Michael sat at the defense table, dressed in an expensive suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression carefully neutral. Judge entered, and everyone stood. She took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with the practiced eye of someone who had seen thousands of trials. "Let the record reflect that this is State v. Michael James Mitchell," Judge announced. "The defendant is charged with 3 counts of child sexual abuse and 1 count of endangerment of a child. Mr. Mitchell, how do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Michael said, his voice steady. The trial proper began with opening statements. Ada Sarah presented a compelling narrative. She outlined the chain of events, the discovery on the sidewalk, the medical examination, the physical evidence, the forensic findings. She described what she would prove, that Michael Mitchell had systematically sexually and physically abused his 3-year-old daughter over a period of months. "The evidence will show," told the jury, her voice steady and authoritative, "that this child was failed by the one person who should have protected her above all others. But this child showed incredible bravery in disclosing her abuse. And the evidence, the medical evidence, the forensic evidence, the physical evidence, will corroborate every word she spoke. Vincent Carlisle stood for the defense opening. He didn't deny that a child had been injured. Instead, he planted seeds of doubt. He suggested that the investigation had been contaminated by leading questions. He implied that zealous prosecutors and investigators had implanted false memories in a confused child. He argued that the physical injuries could have innocent explanations. He portrayed Michael as a man unfairly accused, devastated by allegations he categorically. The burden of proof rests on the state, Carlisle reminded the jury. The state must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. I will show you that there is substantial reasonable doubt about whether my client committed these crimes. The prosecution's case began methodically. Officer James took the stand first, testifying about his initial encounter with Sarah, her disclosure of the bad man, and the protocols he followed. He was professional, precise, and credible. Cross-examination by Carlisle was polite but pointed. "Officer," Carlisle asked, "you had never spoken with this child before that day, correct?" "That's correct," acknowledged. "And this child could barely speak. She communicated primarily through gestures and limited vocabulary, didn't she?" "She was limited in her communication," agreed, "but she was clear about what she was saying." "But those two words, bad man, could have referred to anyone, couldn't they? A teacher, a family friend, a neighbor." "Possibly," conceded, but her behavior and her indication of her home suggested otherwise. "Her behavior," Carlisle repeated. "Officer, you're not a psychologist, are you?" "No, I'm not." "You're not trained in child psychology or trauma assessment." "I've received training in recognizing signs of abuse." "But you're not an expert in that field." "No," admitted. Carlisle had scored his first small victory, establishing that Officer was a lay observer, not an expert. It was a subtle move, but it planted a seed of doubt about the officer's interpretations. Then Dr. Hammond took the stand. She was the prosecution's most important witness. Her testimony would be detailed, medical, and clinical. She described Sarah's interview, the dolls, the disclosures. She described the physical examination in precise detail. She presented photographs and medical findings. Her voice was calm and professional, but her passion for protecting this child was evident. "Dr. Hammond," Ada asked, "in your professional opinion, based on the medical findings and Sarah's disclosure, was this child sexually abused?" "Yes," Dr. Hammond said definitively. "Without question, the physical findings are consistent with repeated penetrative sexual abuse." But when Carlisle cross-examined her, he attacked from every angle. He suggested that the bruising could have innocent causes. He questioned whether Sarah could have self-inflicted injuries. He implied that the examination itself could have caused some of the injuries Dr. Hammond documented. "Dr. Hammond, you performed an invasive internal examination on a traumatized child, didn't you?" "I performed a medically necessary examination following proper protocols," Dr. Hammond responded calmly. "But you inserted instruments into this child's body." "I used age-appropriate tools to conduct a thorough examination," Dr. Hammond insisted. "Couldn't that have caused trauma? Couldn't it have caused some of the injuries you documented?" "No," Dr. Hammond said firmly. "These injuries show signs of age and healing patterns that are inconsistent with anything that would have occurred during the examination." The testimony continued for 3 weeks. Teachers from Sarah's about behavioral changes. A trauma psychologist about signs of abuse. Michael's therapist from years past was called as a defense witness to testify that Michael had made good progress in therapy and seemed to have resolved his anger issues. Forensic experts presented technical testimony about the laptop evidence, though Carlisle's cross-examination suggested that the files could have been planted or accessed by others. Each day, the jury sat in their box, listening intently, trying to piece together the truth from competing narratives. Some jurors seemed convinced. Others appeared uncertain. The evidence was substantial, but Carlyle was skillfully casting doubt on almost everything. By the end of 3 weeks of testimony, the prosecution's case was strong but not impenetrable. Carlyle had accomplished what he set out to do. He had raised questions, created reasonable doubt, and portrayed Michael as a victim of overzealous prosecution. During a break in the trial, Ada Sarah spoke with Officer James in a secure hallway outside the courtroom. "He's getting to them," said quietly. "I can see it on their faces. Some of them are starting to believe his narrative." "We still have more evidence," replied. "What we haven't presented yet is crucial." "Do we?" asked. "Sometimes I wonder if we have enough. He's good, too good." The fate of Sarah Mitchell and the prosecution of her abuser hung in the balance, uncertain and precarious, as the trial approached its critical final phase. The prosecution's case was faltering. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury seemed divided. Some jurors leaned toward conviction based on the medical evidence. Others appeared swayed by Carlyle's suggestion that the investigation had been contaminated by leading questions and suggestive interviews. The trial had reached a dangerous tipping point where the evidence, though substantial, was beginning to feel insufficient. Ada Sarah sat at the prosecution table the morning of day 22 of trial, reviewing her notes one final time. She had one more card to play, one last piece of evidence that she had deliberately held in reserve. Carlyle didn't know about it, or if he didn't understand its significance. It was the footage from Officer James' uniform that fateful Tuesday afternoon when he first encountered Sarah on the sidewalk. The video had been deemed admissible after heated legal arguments. Judge had ruled that it was relevant, that it showed the child's spontaneous disclosure without any leading questions from law enforcement, and that it could be presented to the jury. It was raw, unfiltered, and most importantly, it was objective evidence that corroborated Sarah's disclosure. "The prosecution calls Officer James back to the stand," Ada announced. There was a stir in the courtroom. Carlyle looked confused. Officer had already days ago. Why was he being called again? Was this a procedural matter, or did the prosecution have something else to present? Officer took the stand again, this time looking more purposeful, more knowing. He knew what was coming. Ada approached him with a small remote-controlled device. "Officer," she began, "when you encountered Sarah Mitchell on the sidewalk that afternoon, were you wearing your body camera?" "Yes, I was." "And does your body camera record audio and video of interactions?" "It does." "Your Honor, I would like to present into Evidence Department Exhibit 47, footage from officer's uniform on Tuesday, September 18th, from 2:15 p.m. to 2:48 p.m. A large screen descended from the ceiling of the courtroom. Carlyle stood abruptly, objecting vociferously. "Your Honor, this footage has not been properly disclosed. This is a surprise ambush. This violates discovery rules." Judge looked at the prosecution table. "Ms., the defense is correct that we should have had advance notice." "Your Honor," Ada responded calmly, "the footage was disclosed in our evidence packet 3 weeks ago. The defense received a full copy of all materials on the evidence drive. The failure to review it is not the prosecution's responsibility." Judge considered this. The evidence was properly disclosed. The objection is overruled. Proceed. Carlyle sat down, furious. He had been outmaneuvered, and he knew it. His paralegal was frantically searching through documents, trying to find the video file that had apparently been buried in the evidence materials. The video began to play. The courtroom fell completely silent. The first images were shaky, the camera angle reflecting the perspective of a tall officer looking down the street. The audio picked up the ambient sounds of the neighborhood, distant traffic, birds chirping, the wind rustling through leaves. Then the camera focused on Sarah, a tiny figure in pink overalls and sparkly sneakers standing on the sidewalk, watching the police car approach. The video showed Officer slowing his pace as he approached, heard his gentle voice. "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you okay? Where's your mommy?" Sarah didn't respond. The camera captured her small face, her blue eyes, her unusual stillness. It was the face of a traumatized child, something that was immediately apparent to anyone watching. "Do you live nearby?" Officer asked on the video. "Can you point to your house?" Sarah remained silent. The camera moved as Officer repositioned himself. Duke was visible in the frame, his large form calm and controlled. Then came the moment. "Sarah," Officer asked gently, "can you tell me something? Is there a bad man?" The camera captured Sarah's face with crystal clarity. Her mouth opened, and in a small voice that was barely above a whisper but was absolutely clear on the audio recording, she said, "Bad man." There was something profoundly powerful about seeing and hearing Sarah's disclosure in its raw, unedited form. No leading questions, no suggestions, no contamination from adults, just a 3-year-old child speaking the truth about her suffering. Several jurors shifted in their seats. One woman's hand went to her mouth. Another juror's eyes became visibly watery. But the video wasn't finished. The camera angle shifted as Officer worked to calm Sarah. Then something extraordinary happened on the recording, something that would later become the subject of extensive expert debate. Officer, following protocol to ensure he had the correct house, positioned Duke to help establish the child's home location. The German Shepherd had been trained in multiple detection capabilities. One of his specialized skills was the ability to alert on specific indicators of human distress, not as a formal accusation, but as a supplementary investigative tool that had proven reliable in certain situations. As Duke approached the front of the Mitchell house, visible in the background of the footage, the dog's behavior changed noticeably. His ears perked up. His body became tense and alert. He began pulling slightly on his leash, a subtle but unmistakable indication that he was sensing something that triggered his training responses. Officer on the video said, "Easy, Duke, it's okay, boy." But Duke continued to display heightened alertness, specifically when oriented toward the Mitchell house. The dog's behavioral response, captured on objective video, lasted for approximately 45 seconds before Officer led him away. The courtroom watched this unfold in absolute silence. The prosecution had presented what amounts to 3 independent pieces of evidence in a single video: Sarah's spontaneous, clear disclosure, Officer's appropriate investigative technique, and a trained police dog's detection response to whatever was present in that house. When the video ended, there was a moment of profound silence in the courtroom. Several jurors were openly crying now. Others stared ahead with expressions of shock and understanding. Carlisle stood to cross-examine, but he was clearly shaken. "Officer, you positioned that dog deliberately near the house, didn't you? You were trying to prompt the dog to respond." "No," Officer said firmly. "I was trying to establish which house was the child's home. The dog's response was his response. I didn't coach him or train him to alert to anything specific." "Can you explain the dog's behavior?" Carlisle pressed. "The dog responded to something," Officer said simply. "What that something was, I can't say with certainty, but his behavior was consistent with his training in detecting human distress." "Your Honor," Carlisle said, standing, "I move to strike the dog's behavior from the record as unreliable and prejudicial." Judge said, "The evidence is probative, and while the jury may weigh it however they see fit, it is admissible." Carlisle sat down, defeated. The psychological momentum in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The jury had seen and heard, with their own eyes and ears, a traumatized child's disclosure. They had witnessed a trained police dog's response. The evidence that had seemed ambiguous now felt compellingly clear. Ada Sarah had no further questions. Officer was excused. As he stepped down from the witness stand, he made eye contact with Corinne Mitchell, who was crying quietly in the gallery. The judge called for a brief recess. As the jury filed out, one juror, an older man in the back row, looked directly at Michael Mitchell with an expression of absolute certainty. Michael's face had gone pale. His attorney was whispering urgently to him, but Michael wasn't listening. He knew, with the clarity of someone who understands he has been caught, that the trial was now essentially over. Carlyle had been outmaneuvered. The prosecution had saved their most powerful evidence for the moment when doubt was creeping into the jury's mind, and they had used it perfectly. The video was objective, undeniable, and emotionally devastating. Sarah Mitchell, though she would never consciously remember this moment, had finally been heard, not just by her family or her therapists or the investigators, but by 12 citizens sworn to determine the truth. And the truth, captured on video in its form, was undeniable. The courtroom had frozen, and in that frozen moment, justice had found its footing. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 23 minutes. For those who waited in the courthouse hallways, the prosecutors, the police officers, Corinne Mitchell, and the journalists who camped outside hopping for updates, those hours felt both infinite and terrifyingly brief. Sarah was not in the courthouse. She remained with her aunt, protected from the media frenzy and the legal machinery that was determining her father's fate. Her therapist, doctor, had advised that exposure to the trial proceedings would only further traumatize the already injured child. At 4:47 p.m., word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly with the peculiar electricity that accompanies such moments, the electric charge of finality, of judgment, of a community's determination about what was true and what was false. Judge entered, and the room fell silent. The jury filed in, their faces carefully neutral, trained to not reveal their decision through expression or body language. Michael Mitchell sat at the defense table, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume, his carefully groomed appearance now suggesting only someone performing the role of innocence. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge asked the foreman, an older woman named again. The name coincidence struck everyone who noted it. "We have, Your Honor," replied, standing and holding a folder containing the jury's written verdict. "On the charge of child sexual abuse in the first degree, how do you find?" Opened the folder, the courtroom held its breath. "Guilty," she said clearly. Corinne Mitchell made a small sound, half sob, half gasp. Her hand covered her mouth. "On the charge of child sexual abuse in the second degree, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of aggravated child endangerment, how do you find?" "Guilty." By the time the fourth and final guilty verdict was announced, the courtroom had erupted into careful, controlled reactions. Judge gavelled for order, but her own expression suggested relief. Justice had found its verdict. The system had worked, despite Carlyle's best efforts to cloud the truth with reasonable doubt. Michael Mitchell's face went. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Carlyle himself looked defeated. He had lost. Despite his considerable skill and expensive strategy, he had been outmaneuvered by superior prosecution work and, most importantly, by objective evidence that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. "The jury is thanked for your service," Judge announced. "This court is adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for sentencing." Outside the courthouse, Ada Sarah spoke to waiting reporters. "Justice has been served today," she said into the cameras. "A jury of Michael Mitchell's peers reviewed the evidence and determined that he committed these terrible crimes against his own daughter. This verdict sends a powerful message that our community takes child protection seriously, that we believe children, and that we will hold accountable those who harm society's most vulnerable members." That night, Corinne Mitchell sat in her sister's living room with Sarah asleep on her lap. She wept, not entirely from sadness, but from a complex mixture of emotions: grief for what her daughter had endured, anger at Michael for his betrayal, relief that there was now a legal acknowledgement of the truth, and deep, profound sadness that her family, the life she had imagined, would never exist. The sentencing hearing the next morning was brief. Michael stood before Judge, who had reviewed pre-sentence investigation reports, victim impact statements, and psychological evaluations. Judge's expression was grave. "Michael James Mitchell," Judge began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 4 counts related to the sexual and physical abuse of your 3-year-old daughter. This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the applicable law. Do you have anything to say before this court imposes sentence?" Michael stood, and for a moment it seemed he might finally break, might finally acknowledge what he had done. But instead he said simply, "I'm innocent. I didn't do this. This is all a terrible mistake." Judge's expression hardened. "I have reviewed the evidence in this case, and I find your continued denial to be not only unpersuasive but deeply troubling. It suggests a complete lack of remorse and accountability. The victim impact statement provided by your daughter's therapist describes a traumatized child who will require years of intensive therapy to process what was done to her. That child will carry the scars of your abuse for the rest of her life." The judge adjusted her glasses and read from her sentencing decision. "This court sentences you to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Upon release, you will be required to register as a sex offender for life. You will be prohibited from any contact with the victim or her family members. You will be required to participate in sex offender treatment programming as a condition of parole, and you will be ordered to pay restitution to cover the costs of the victim's ongoing therapy and psychological care." The gavel came down. 20 years. It wasn't life without parole, but it was substantial. It was justice rendered through the legal system. Michael was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look back at Karen, didn't acknowledge the family members in the gallery, didn't show any emotion as he was escorted from the courtroom. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began her long journey toward healing. Doctor, her trauma therapist, worked with her using play therapy, art therapy, and age-appropriate interventions designed to help her process her experiences. Sarah would likely never consciously remember the abuse. The human brain at age 3 has limited capacity for forming lasting memories of traumatic events. But her body remembered. Her nervous system carried the imprint. The hypervigilance, the nightmares, the behavioral regression, these would take time to heal. But there was something powerful happening. Sarah was safe now. Her mother was no longer in denial. The adults around her had taken her seriously, had believed her, had taken action. In the child development literature, this is one of the most important factors in trauma recovery. Children who are believed and protected often show remarkable resilience. Officer James received a commendation from the police department. He was invited to speak at conferences about trusting your instincts, about listening to children, about the importance of thorough investigation and proper evidence collection. But what mattered most to him was a single moment months later when he encountered Sarah with her mother at the grocery store. Sarah was holding her mother's hand, looking healthier and happier than when he had first seen her on that sidewalk. She didn't recognize him, but Karen did. She approached him, tears in her eyes, and simply said, "Thank you. Thank you for listening to her. Thank you for believing her when no one else was paying attention." Dr. Hammond continued her work at the hospital, training other pediatricians on how to recognize and document child abuse. The Mitchell case had become a teaching case, used in medical schools and law schools as an example of how proper documentation and thorough investigation could lead to justice. The case of State v. Michael James Mitchell became a landmark in state jurisprudence, cited in legal opinions regarding the admissibility of K-9 behavioral evidence in child protection cases, and discussed extensively in articles about prosecuting child abuse. 1 year after the verdict, Sarah celebrated her 4th birthday. She was in therapy twice a week, showing signs of healing and resilience. She had nightmares sometimes, and she had learned to be cautious around men she didn't know well. But she was also learning to laugh again, to play, to be a child. Corinne had divorced Michael formally and rebuilt her life. She had become an advocate for child protection, speaking at community events about recognizing the signs of abuse, about the importance of listening to children's voices, no matter how small or difficult to understand. Officer James still walked Duke through Riverside Estates, still greeted the neighbors he had come to know, still maintained the vigilance that had characterized his entire career. And every time he passed the intersection of Maple and Riverside, he thought of that Tuesday afternoon and the two words that had changed everything. Sarah Mitchell, the 3-year-old girl who had found the courage to speak truth to power, who had faced a police dog and a uniformed officer, and somehow known that she could trust them with her devastating secret. That Sarah would grow up in a community that had learned to listen to children, to believe them, and to take their disclosures seriously. Justice had been served not through perfection or certainty, but through the combination of careful investigation, objective evidence, professional expertise, and the profound bravery of a small child who had refused to remain silent. And in a suburban neighborhood where families had once felt that nothing bad could ever happen, the residents learned an important lesson: that evil can hide behind the facades of respectability, but that truth, when finally spoken, cannot be. The case was closed, the verdict was final, the sentence was imposed, and in the quiet that followed, a small girl began to heal. The end.